I first became familiar with Tesla in 1976. I was working on an article on a guru by the name of Lapsang Rampa.
Yes.
And he had written a number of books, and I was. It turns out that he's British, and he's got the spirit of a Tibetan, flowing through him. So I was writing an article for a magazine, a national magazine, and I'd gone down to New York to do some research, and there was a book on Rampa, and it was on other avatars, these enlightened beings who come to the earth. Jesus was mentioned, and then there was this guy Tesla, and it said Tesla invented all these things. You listed all of them in the preamble: fluorescent lights, wireless communication, remote control, electrical power system, and his name was Tesla, and I had never heard of him. And my father was an electrical engineer. He fixed TVs in the early 1950s. I used to go out with my dad. I had a crystal radio set, which was a wireless radio set, and so I knew a bit about electricity. And I said, if this guy really lived and he invented all these things as much as Edison, I would know who he was. So since I was in the New York Public Library, I started to research him, and I found there were articles with his name on it from 1915, 1918. And I said, wow, this guy's real. He's actually real. So I then got a book of his patents. And once I saw it, it's like a 500-page book. It's got articles and patents that he's written. And I dug into the patents, and I said, my gosh, he really has patents on all these things. I'm going to find out if it's really him or Marconi who invented the radio, if it's really him or Edison is responsible for our electrical power system, that kind of thing. And he became the subject of my doctoral dissertation, and that was really how I got interested in Tesla.
So you actually got interested in Tesla from Rampa's writings? You said Rampa actually mentioned him? Is that what you said?
No, it was in a book about avatars.
I see.
Enlightened beings. And it listed a bunch of them. One was Rampa, and I was reading the book because I was writing an article on him, and another was this guy Tesla.
Now, you said you picked up the book of patents. What are some of those patents that you read about?
Well, Tesla really is the primary inventor behind the radio. And, I set out, in a sense, to disprove it because I didn't believe that one guy could be behind all of these things. He's got patents on the radio. He's got patents on wireless. He has patents on what's called the Tesla coil. He has a patent on an oscillator which produces a complex frequency, a continuous wave frequency. When Marconi was transmitting across the Atlantic, he was using Morse code, dot, 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 dash, dash, dash. And you can't transmit voice or pictures or sound through a dot, dot, dot kind of a Morse code kind of a system. We use continuous wave frequencies, and those are Tesla frequencies, so that it's an oscillator that he produced. So when you go back to the history of television, you'll find that the first TV images, which were produced around 1905, were using Tesla oscillators and Tesla currents. So there are patents on that. There's a patent on cell phone technology, where Tesla is able to explain to J.P. Morgan at the turn of the century, this is 1901, that he can create an unlimited number of wireless telephone stations. And this is way before we had wireless telephone, but he had already had the patent on how to do it. Now every single person on the planet practically has their own cell phone, and it's all based on Tesla's patents. Also, they are outlawing incandescent lamps. The Edison lamps are being outlawed, and Tesla's the inventor of fluorescent lighting. He has also patents on hydroelectric power system that we have, and he's also got a patent on what became the Osprey helicopter. It's a $40 million plane that takes off like a helicopter and then flies like a regular plane. It's a tilt rotor. The propeller tilts forward. You mentioned the word genius, and Tesla really is a genius. I mean, I think the word is way overused, but he is an inventor in many different realms. He didn't just stay in one. Most great people stay in one field, and that's what they're good at. He was in a number of different fields, and he excelled in all of those, and he's behind a lot of he lays the foundation for things, for so many technologies.
Let's go back a little bit and talk about when Tesla first came over here, where he was born, and his arrival into the United States. What can you tell us about that?
Well, Tesla was born in 1856 in Smiljan. If you've ever been to Rome, about 150 miles across the Adriatic is where Smiljan is. It would take, I don't know, 8 or 9 or 10 hours to drive it, but you can get there by plane in very rapid fashion. It's near, maybe it's about an hour south of Zagreb in Croatia. And so he was born in Croatia, but he was a Serb. There were two main groups in that area of the world. There were the Croats and the Serbs. They're the exact same people biologically, but one are Roman Catholics and the other are Greek Orthodox.
Okay.
And they don't like each other, unfortunately. So Tesla grew up in a hostile environment. What's good about it is that he's a sign of unity for those two countries that are still actually fighting against each other. Even today, they don't like each other. But they can both claim Tesla because he was born in one country and he was the religion of another. So his father was a priest because the Greek Orthodox priests could get married. And his father wanted him to either join the priesthood or maybe go into the military. And eventually he ended up, studying electricity. And he said, I want to devote my life to electricity. And he went to college in Austria and then in Prague, at the University of Prague. And he was an A-plus student, but he never really graduated college. But he took, advanced geometry and physics and calculus and all these great courses. But he didn't need a 4-year degree in those days. This was about 1875. And he went out on his own, and he started to work eventually for Tom Edison in Paris. And he was a troubleshooter in Paris.
Now, let me ask quickly before you go any further. You said he became interested in electricity. What kind of experiments were being done with electricity at that time that he would have become more fascinated with it? Where was electricity at that point? Well,
I've been to his place in Smiljan, and it's against a long plain. It's a hill against a long plain. You can see the mountains, the Dinaric Alps in the distance, maybe 20, 30 miles away. So he had to have seen unbelievable lightning storms because he could see easily 20 miles from his house. And he also discussed static electricity that came off his cat. And his cat would be electrified, like in the winter. You'd see a corona of light around the cat sometimes. Sparks would fly. But in those days, they had what was known as direct current. And that's what Edison was using. And direct current, electricity by its nature alternates, which means that it changes its direction of flow at many times a second. So if you think of a stream going downhill, you would harness a stream with a water wheel. But can you imagine if the stream was going downhill and then going uphill and then going downhill and then going uphill and trying to put a water wheel on that?
Right.
No one knew how to do that. And so what they did was they got rid of the uphill stream and they just dealt with the downhill stream, and that's what direct current was. But it was very inefficient. So you could only send electricity about a mile in those days and only for lighting houses. You couldn't run a refrigerator. You couldn't run a vacuum cleaner. You could just light a house, and you had to have a power plant at every mile. That's the world that Tesla grew up in. And when he was in college, he had a vision that you could do away with the commutator, which was creating just the downstream, and that you could harness the alternating current. The current is changing its direction, unencumbered, without any mechanical means. And it took him about 5 years to figure it out of daily work. And once he did, that was the invention that he tried to show Edison. He tried to show Edison's boss in Paris in 1883, and then he came to New York and he worked for Tom Edison right on South Fifth Avenue. And he tried to show Edison the alternating current system even then. And Edison was in a battle against Westinghouse and Thomson Houston in those days. And they were both using AC. It was an inferior system to Tesla's, but Edison wanted nothing to do with AC, and so he and Tesla didn't get along, unfortunately, and Tesla ended up quitting working for Edison about 1884. So that's really the early story.
What was it particularly, though, that was about AC that made Edison so against using it? I mean, is there anything particular that you could throw out that would just give an indication why he was so hostile, or was he just hostile towards Tesla? or did he actually have a reason?
I don't think it was hostile towards Tesla. I think there were a couple of reasons. Number one, Elihu Thomson there were three major electrical companies in the early 1880s. There was the Thomson-Houston Company, the Westinghouse Company, and the Edison Electric Company. And Edison had used direct current for 20 years. 20 years is a long time.
True.
And he had all of his buildings set up. He was powering Wall Street with direct current. So how do you harness a stream that's going downstream, then upstream, then downstream, and upstream at thousands of times a second? He couldn't conceive of how it could be done. And at the same time, Elihu Thomson had stolen one of his light bulbs and was manufacturing them at a more efficient rate than Edison was. And Edison was in a legal battle with Westinghouse on another light bulb patent. So he didn't like Thomson, and he didn't like Westinghouse, and both those guys were AC guys.
Got it.
So I think it was a combination of those two factors that didn't allow him to look at Tesla's invention more carefully.
So Tesla then left Edison, working for Edison. Did he go right to George Westinghouse at that time, or where did he go next?
Well, Edison had promised him $50,000 to redesign his DC equipment, which Tesla really did. And Tesla actually thought he was going to get paid, and Edison said, I was kidding you. I was joking. I wasn't really going to give you $50,000. And Tesla, who was a new guy from Serbia, Serb from Croatia, didn't understand that Edison was kidding around. He became a ditch digger for a year. But Westinghouse heard about his invention. And Westinghouse, there was a debate as to how much he actually got. When I was in Serbia, I was at the Tesla Museum, and I found a letter that he wrote to John Jacob Astor, who later backed him. And in this letter, he tells Astor that he got $500,000 plus royalties, which he eventually gave up. Now, he had to share that with some backers. So his actual take was probably about $250,000. That's still a lot of money today, but that was over maybe 7 or 8 years in the early 1890s. So he was getting $20,000-$30,000 a year for 8 or 10 years for the invention, and that's really what he got.
And that's the invention of the alternating current
system. Yeah. Now this system had 40 different patents. So in that system was the induction motor, the motor that you find, as mentioned, inside refrigerators, inside vacuum cleaners. It runs the whole world, the induction motor. Plus, it's the system put in at Niagara Falls, the hydroelectric power system. So there's turbines involved. There's 40 different patents. One of the interesting things about Tesla, though, is he had a mentality that was truly amazing, because he figured that if he could invent a motor that would do the work instead of, let's say, a horse, you could save tremendous man-hours. If you wanted to plow a field with a horse or with a motor, the motor would save you man-hours. He calculated that his invention would literally save hundreds of thousands of man-hours per year, so that humans, instead of doing slave labor, they would go back to school and they would become more enlightened. They wouldn't have to do, the grunt work of plowing fields and doing that kind of thing. So he was thinking on how he could transform humanity through his inventions. That was all part of what he was doing.
Yeah, he was. I guess that's why he would be in that book of avatars then, because he was definitely thinking in terms of what could improve the human race and improve the status of mankind. So now, what happened a little bit later, though? Now, he's also responsible for the hydroelectric system at Niagara Falls. That is correct.
Yes. Well, what happens is that's the prize. So Niagara Falls was not harnessed till 1897. So back around 1890, he sells his invention to Westinghouse, and J.P. Morgan, who was backing Edison, goes to Thomson, who was the third guy, and he says to Thomson, let me buy you out, and I'll try to create a monopoly here. We'll see if we can get Westinghouse under the same umbrella. And Elihu Thomson says, why should you buy me out? Edison is losing money, and I'm making money. So Morgan says, okay, then you buy us out. So this is a true story. Edison comes home one day to his electrical plant, and he sees his name being taken off the marquee, and they remove the name Edison Electric, and they create General Electric. GE was created by combining the Edison company with the Thomson-Houston company, and Edison dropped out of electricity and never dealt with electricity again. He moved into motion pictures. But this all took about 4 or 5 years to totally happen. In the midst of all that, they were in a bidding war as to who was going to win the prize to harness Niagara Falls. And the first way station along the way was the Chicago World's Fair of 1893. Mm-hmm. So what Westinghouse did was he took $1 million loss, and he won the right to light the fair with the Tesla system. And it was 1893, became the first city ever lit with the Tesla system. And again, to put it into perspective, from one city, you could run power plants, you could run electrical motors, you could run factories, and operate machinery with Tesla's system. Whereas with Edison's system, all you could do was light bulbs, and the farther away you were from the power source, the dimmer your light bulbs were. So once Westinghouse won the right to harness to the Chicago Fair, that gave him a big in to win Niagara Falls. But Edison didn't give up, and he started electrocuting cats and dogs, and he even electrocuted an elephant at Coney Island with Tesla's system. And he was saying, the first time someone plugs in the Tesla system, the housewife is going to get electrocuted.
But he had already seen that, and he already knew that you said the Chicago the whole World's Fair in Chicago was lit by Tesla at that point with alternating current, or is it the city of Chicago?
Yes, the whole. It was really just the fair, but it was a huge enterprise.
Okay, and Edison had already seen that, but even so, he still did not give up. You're saying? Right,
because the prize of harnessing Niagara Falls was so huge, and Edison was such a gigantic character. I mean, he was the biggest guy in town, and he was backed by Morgan. He was still, in the game at this point. What they were planning on doing was they were planning on putting all of the factories in the Northeast along the falls, because if Edison had won, you couldn't send electricity more than a couple of miles at the most.
Of course.
And so all of the factories in the Northeast were getting ready to move up to Buffalo, and even Buffalo was too far away. You would have to go to Niagara to do it.
Mm-hmm.
And what Tesla was saying was, if you put my system in, I will send 400,000 volts along a wire, and I'll light up Chicago from Niagara Falls. I'll light up Philadelphia. I'll light up Boston. I'll light up Toronto and New York. And everyone said, you're nuts. There's no way you can light up New York and Philadelphia and Chicago from Niagara Falls. And so Tesla was perceived as this, magician, this guy from another world who said these crazy things. But the fact of the matter was, it was true. And if you look at, you're from this area of New England, New York, New England, you know that all the big factories from the 1890s are all along rivers.
Right.
Once the hydroelectric power system was put in, you could put a factory in the middle of a forest. You didn't have to be by a river anymore. That's how transformative Tesla's invention is. And the other important thing about it is, which people seem to forget, it's renewable because it's running on a waterfall, and it's non-polluting. They keep talking about, let's get nuclear power back. And nuclear power, it's nuts to get nuclear power back. It's a very scary thing. It's very expensive. What do you do with the waste? And what do you do with terrorism? With hydroelectric power, there is no terrorism because there's no waste, there's no radiation. It's clean and renewable. And so I think that one of the keys is to continue to use hydroelectric and continue in that direction.
Now, after Tesla, this happened, this great moment for Tesla, and he won this situation between him and Edison with the hydroelectric power at Niagara Falls. What did that do for his career? What did that do for him as a person and his stature as an inventor?
His picture was on the front page of the World, which was like the New York Times of the day, and lit up like a Christmas tree, electrical corona around his body. He was also on the front page of the New York Times. He was world famous. His friends at the time were John Jacob Astor, who was the richest man in the world. He moved into the Waldorf Astoria, which was built by I asked her. He was friends with Mark Twain, Rudyard Kipling. Twain and Kipling were the two most famous literary people in the world who were friends of Tesla. I have, letters between those guys in my book.
What sort of things do they talk about? Just out of curiosity, now that you mentioned that, just what do they talk about?
Well, I knew that Twain had been in his laboratory in April of 1894, and when I was working on my doctorate, I was out in California, and I got my doctorate from Saybrook University, which is in San Francisco, but I was staying in Berkeley, and I was using the library, and I got to the library, and I look on the board, and it says the Twain Diaries. So I go to the head desk there. I said, "You have the diaries of Mark Twain?" "Oh yeah, we got all of them." I said, "You mean you got 1894?" "Oh yeah, we got." "You mean you have April of 1894?" "Yeah, we got April of 1894." My heart is like pumping like crazy.
With excitement, yeah, sure.
So I go up to the second floor and I get out the diary. It's a copy. I'm not holding the actual physical diary, but it's a copy of everything that he wrote. And he's talking about Stanford Blight and other people in Maine. And I get to the very day of the day that he's at the lab, not a thing in it. There's not one mention of it. But there is a letter that I did find at Columbia University where Twain says to Tesla, in the letter, he says, "I can't get there Friday, but can I come next week?" or something like that. And there's very famous photos, you can easily find them online, of Twain in Tesla's laboratory. The other one with Kipling, Tesla had a great sense of humor, and he was friends with the Johnsons, Robert and Catherine Johnson. Robert was editor of the Century magazine, which was kind of like the New Yorker, but everyone read the Century in those days. It was much more popular than the New Yorker today. And he says to the Johnsons, "I just had lunch with Rudyard Kipling in Greenwich Village. He took me to some obscure hotel where I was sure to find hair and cockroaches in the soup." So he was a funny guy, had a great sense of humor, and he wined and dined with these guys, played pool with them at the Players Club.
So from that position in his life, he ended up with financing by J.P. Morgan for this great project of his, Wardenclyffe, Long Island, Wardenclyffe Tower. Now, that was ultimately, I think, is possible undoing. Let's talk about that for a little bit. How did he get started with Wardenclyffe? How did he entice J.P. Morgan into funding that project?
Well, what happened was when they launched Niagara Falls, it was such a huge enterprise. Westinghouse had to form a partnership with Morgan, and Westinghouse got trolley patents in exchange for Morgan being able to work on the Niagara Falls project. This is all important because Morgan knows that it's Tesla's invention. One of the things about this is that the subway system is built on Tesla's electrical system. When you go into the New York subway system, it's all built on Tesla's inventions. And so Westinghouse...
What do you mean? You mean the alternating current or something in addition to that?
Yeah, the electrical railroad.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
So this was a whole benefit Westinghouse didn't expect at all. He just thought he was getting a lighting system. He didn't even know you could transmit huge amounts of power. And so when Tesla was running out of money, he would go back to Westinghouse and he would say, "How about giving me a few more bucks? You got this huge benefit. Electrical railroad is built, the subway system built on my inventions." And Westinghouse, of course, didn't give him more money. He himself had problems. But this is all in the background. And Tesla was started to do these giant experiments with electrical lightning bolts that were very large. And he was on Houston Street, in New York City near the Brooklyn Bridge. And it was getting too dangerous. So he moved out to Colorado Springs. He had $100,000 from John Jacob Astor. And he was working on two avenues. One was wireless communication, and the other was fluorescent lighting. And so when he got back to New York in 1901, he was invited to Morgan's daughter's wedding. And the King of England was there, Grover Cleveland, presidents of the United States were there. Everybody was there. Mm-hmm. And at that time, he was invited back for Thanksgiving. It was the day after, like the Friday, when everyone, for the leftovers and stuff. And he had dinner at Morgan's house, and he brought some of his fluorescent light bulbs and things like that. And he formed a partnership with Morgan. Morgan would go to Europe every year, year after year. He spent 4 or 5 months in Europe buying art and just enjoying himself. And he wanted to be able to follow the stock market in Wall Street when he was in London. And Tesla promised that he could do that. And that was pretty much what Morgan kind of understood the relationship was going to be. So Morgan gave Tesla $150,000 to build this wireless plant out on Long Island, and from that plant he was hoping to have wireless communication to London.
That was Morgan's primary understanding of what Wardenclyffe Tower was about.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. A wireless system to London, so he could follow the yacht races and follow the ticker tape on Wall Street.
Okay.
Now, at the same time, when Tesla had lectured in Europe, in London, at the Royal Academy of Science, and he was friends with Sir William Preece and Lord Kelvin and many other, Lord Raleigh, many of these people, and a number of them became consultants for Marconi. Marconi was about 18 or 19 years old, 20 years old. He was a young man.
Mm-hmm.
And he was working, sending dots and dashes, Morse code, and he was planning on sending Morse code across the Atlantic. Tesla was working with continuous waves, which was a continuous frequencies where you could send complex information. All of our radio and television, when television used to go through the airwaves, is all done with Tesla currents. It's Tesla waves. So that's basically what was happening. And so Tesla was negotiating with one of Marconi's consultants, Sir William Preece, and Preece said, "Can we use some of your oscillators?" And Tesla said, "Fine." And Marconi told Tesla, "I don't need your oscillators. I can do this on my own." So Marconi basically, pirated Tesla's invention and then wrote about it and said it's easy to send wireless information. You just use a Tesla coil, et cetera, et cetera. And Tesla freaked out. So he decided to double the size of the tower that he was building. So the tower was 90 feet tall. That's what he negotiated with Morgan. And he figured with a 90-foot tall tower, I could transmit electricity communication to England. But if I double the size of the tower to 180 feet and I go down another 120 feet, so the whole it went down 10 stories underground.
My goodness.
The whole length of the actual tower was 300 feet when you count the top and the bottom. With that, you could send impulses to the Pacific Ocean, or to Japan and China, as well as to Europe. So his theory was, if I double the size of the tower, not only will I go to Europe, I'll be able to control the whole entire Earth with a wireless system. So the cost will only double, but the revenues would be practically infinite because I get money from every single country in the world. That was basically his theory. Meanwhile, while all this was happening, Marconi sent ... across the Atlantic, and he became world famous, and he gets the Nobel Prize for it, and everyone knows Marconi is the inventor of the radio. So when Morgan returns to New York, there's a stock market crash, which Morgan is involved with, and McKinley gets shot. And I'm not kidding. Tesla actually writes to his architect, which is Stanford White, who designed Madison Square Garden. He said to White, while McKinley lay dying, McKinley was shot, it took him a week to die. He writes to White, he said, "You think McKinley's got problems?" Because he's got to go back to Morgan and ask him for more money. So once Morgan finds out that Tesla doubled the size of the tower, and Tesla says, "I need more money to complete the tower," Morgan said, "You breached the contract. I'm not going to give you any more money." And that basically was the heart and soul of what went wrong. Tesla kept appealing to Morgan, saying, I'm not just talking about money. I'm talking about cell phones, wireless communication. I'm talking about from here to Australia as I'm talking across a table. I'm going to change the whole world. And this is why I mentioned the whole thing of Niagara Falls. He says to Morgan, "I harnessed my Niagara Falls, Mr. Morgan. This is not a boast. This is only my credentials. You must give me the money to complete this great task. You're a great philanthropist," and on and on. And so it's kind of a battle between the two souls of the biggest capitalist in the world and the greatest technologist in the world as to which of those two is going to win.
Now, I'm sorry.
Yes. Go ahead.
My question would be then, had Morgan become aware, first of all, Morgan was disillusioned, not just because of the stock market crash, but because Marconi had already superseded Tesla's, invention, perhaps. And also, now was Morgan aware that Tesla was interested, or did Tesla say that he was interested in supplying free energy for the world with this tower?
This is a complicated question. It's a great question, and maybe it's the most important question. One of the problems was, how do you put a meter on a wireless system? There's a lot of levels to this. We now have very sophisticated computers. When you make a cell phone call, the computer knows where you called and can log how much time and all that. But in 1901, they didn't have that kind of sophistication. What Tesla realized was that the revenues would come in a different way. It would come in the sale of the equipment, and also he's envisioning what literally becomes RCA, NBC. He's envisioning world radio communication. He's envisioning world teletype, where you're on an ocean liner and you get the teletype, the newspaper coming by the wireless. And he's envisioning what will become television. So he's envisioning a number of things. In other words, he's combining, in a sense, the telephone, the telegraph, sending a newspaper print through the mail, radio. Now, radio and television was free up until cable came in, but they make all their money with the advertising. Hundreds of billions of dollars have been generated through radio and television without the subscriber paying a cent. And so Tesla understood that the revenues would come in a different way. And Morgan could not picture how do you make money if you can't put a meter on it. He couldn't envision what Tesla was envisioning.
So now Tesla's stuck out there with a 180-foot tower and another same amount under the ground, essentially, or something close to that. What happened to that tower? Is it still there?
What he does is he raises another $50,000 on his own. He goes to his friends, he goes to his relatives, and even today, you know what it's like even today to try and raise $50,000. It's not easy. So you're going back to 1901. He raises $50,000, and he goes back to Morgan. He says, "I've raised $50,000. I've now put the crown on this tower. For another $75,000, it's complete." And Morgan says, "No." Meanwhile, I'm not kidding. Morgan is spending $150,000 on a painting. He's spending $40,000 on a jewel box from the 1400s. $75,000 is pocket change. So what Tesla does is he goes to Henry Clay Frick and people like that. Morgan had just given Frick $60 million, and gave Carnegie another $360 million to create U.S. Steel. So for Frick to give him another $100,000 was nothing. So he was dealing with Frick, and he was dealing with Thomas Fortune Ryan, and he was dealing with Jacob Schiff, who was the Jewish counterpart to Morgan. And these guys were willing to give him the balance of the money to complete Wardenclyffe. And he sets up meetings with Morgan with these people. And Morgan deep sixes the deal. And I go through that in detail in the book. That's what's so sad about this. This is the real tragedy, is that I think Tesla shouldn't have doubled the size of the tower. He shouldn't have done what he did. But he was trying to say, we got to look beyond money. And another $75,000 or $100,000 to these guys really was pocket change to these guys. It was not a lot of money. So Morgan really ends this thing. So now what happens? Tesla's stuck with this tower. And so what he decides around 1910, this is 1906, he collapses and he has a nervous breakdown. And I show this in a graphology book that I have where his handwriting just falls apart. He's a ruined man. But he comes back from the dregs and he builds himself up and he says, if I can invent something else, I can make the money to resurrect Wardenclyffe. So he invents the steam engine to replace the gasoline engine, and he goes to Henry Ford, and he tries to sell Henry Ford the steam engine because he says, why should we run cars on gasoline? We're going to run out of gasoline, and where we could run it on water and steam. You'd need a little bit of gasoline, but nowhere near the amount that a gasoline car engine would run. And he's thinking that he'll make the money to go back to Wardenclyffe. So he keeps, year after year, he keeps trying to come up with these incredible ideas. He also invented a torpedo with Hammond, and he was working with the Navy. So all of these things are happening as World War I starts to take place.
So now Henry Ford apparently did not go for that idea.
Yeah, unfortunately for Tesla, it did not go. He did not go for it. One of the reasons he didn't, there was the Stanley steamer, was in a car crash. You have the steam, exploding, and it could be very dangerous. Now, the gasoline wasn't dangerous either, but steam, pressurized steam, was a very dangerous thing, and I think that was one of the reasons why Ford didn't go for it. So we're now about 1914, just as World War I is beginning, and Tesla is working with the Germans, and he's telling them how to build wireless plants. And there were two plants. There's one in Sayville on Long Island, and Telefunken had another one in Tuckertown in New Jersey. Meanwhile, the Germans then sink Lusitania, and we end up going into the war. So once the Germans became our enemy, Tesla, cut all ties with the Germans, but he was trying to negotiate with Woodrow Wilson to say, this is a very important tower. My wireless tower is very important. It can be used in wartime. It can even be used as and this whole particle beam weapon thing, it can be used as a weapon system to knock down incoming airplanes. And he was so far ahead of his time with all of this. Anyhow, Woodrow Wilson didn't buy it, and he owed a ton of money to the Waldorf Astoria in back rent because Astor had died in the sinking of the Titanic. Astor didn't care about the money, but the next guy, Bolt, did. So he gave the tower to Henry Bolt, who was running the Waldorf Astoria, as collateral against the $20,000 that he owed in back rent for the Waldorf. And what Bolt did was he just took the tower down and sold it for scrap.
Now, I heard the tower was originally tried out, though. Did anybody? That's what I read. Did that happen?
Yes. In 1903, Westinghouse comes back to take his turbine. It runs on this huge generator, and it was like a $25,000 generator. And the Westinghouse people come in to take the generator. And Tesla goes to Westinghouse and says, look, your whole fortune is built on my stuff. I know I owe you $25,000, but you can't take this generator out. And Westinghouse says, I'm sorry, we have to take it. We're coming to get it. We're getting it next Friday. So Tesla jury-rigs the whole thing right before it. And in 1903, he electrifies Wardenclyffe, and he sets this thing off. And I have the description there, but, you could even see it from Connecticut. So he really did fire the thing up.
Well, so he did actually fire it up. If Wardenclyffe had been allowed to go ahead and be completed, what kind of changes do you think that would mean for us in today's world?
What I think would have happened, I'm not sure about transmitting great amounts of electrical power. He thought he could light up the Paris Exposition of 1902 or 1903 from Long Island. One of the biggest mistakes Tesla made was not building the tower at Niagara Falls. He built it on Long Island, and I grew up on Long Island, you grew up on Long Island. There's nothing there. There's no power source. There's no waterfalls. So they ran on coal. If he had gone to Niagara Falls, he would have had an unlimited source of power right nearby. But either way, if he had harnessed Wardenclyffe, for sure what I think he would have had was wireless phones. I think that would be the most important thing he would have had, and probably teletype.
What about free electricity for the world? Would that have been a part of it or not?
That was part of his scheme, but there's a debate about whether he would have achieved that. But let's just deal with a powerful wireless phone. The Titanic wouldn't have sunk if they had a decent. They could have gotten help if they had a decent wireless system in those days. They were stuck with the Marconi system. Radio would have come in instead of 1920. Radio would have come in around 1903 or 1904.
Wow.
I do not think Adolf Hitler would have been able to achieve all the horrible things that he achieved if a powerful wireless system had been put in 20 years earlier than it was. Look at how East Germany fell so rapidly. China, as repressive as the top of regime is, the Chinese people are hip. They know what's going on because of mass communication. So had a mass communication system come in 1902 or 1903 under Tesla's direction as opposed to slowly, in a dribbly way, in 1920 under a lesser, people that didn't really understand the enormous power that was inherent there, and it was just radio. It wasn't wireless telephone. I mean, right now, I'm literally emailing all the time. China, England, and then some other country. I have friends in these places. It's like, talking right now, you and I are talking. You can Skype all over the world. That's the world that Tesla was envisioning. And he writes a letter. He writes an article in 1904. This is his brilliance, David. He writes in 1904, he says, help me complete this tower, Mr. Morgan. I will make the whole world like a brain, as it were, which will feel in all its parts. Do you see what I mean? He's envisioning the globe as a giant brain where every part of the world will be interacting and we'll have world peace. So I think that whether or not he would provide electrical power, I don't know, but mass communication and the education of the masses, the unification of the world through this mass system, I think would have happened if Morgan had just given him the money to complete Wardenclyffe.
Wow, what an interesting fellow. Let me just say to our listeners, by the way, again, I want to thank you for listening, and I do want to invite you to call in on next 15 minutes or so. Please call in and ask your questions of Dr. Cypher. I'm sure he'll be happy to answer them. Now, let's talk a little bit more about this guy, Tesla, and that his peculiarities, because you talked about Colorado and him being in Colorado. Now, I saw a movie a ways back, The Prestige, and it was Hugh Jackman and Christian Bale, and David Bowie played Tesla. And, of course, he's behind this huge sort of spooky-looking mansion where he's doing his creations, and he creates a teleportation machine, which what it actually does is ultimately, as Hugh Jackman finds out, it creates duplicate copies of whatever, or whether it's an article of clothing or even a person. So that's basically the premise of where the movie goes. And that's how he's been represented, and that's how he's represented a lot of times as this sort of, guy that's very bright and brilliant, but just definitely out of the box, definitely off the beaten path. I'm not going to ask you if he created a teleportation machine or a duplicating machine. I'm not going to ask you that. But where did he get this reputation from for being a bit of a kook, for being a bit of a madman?
By the way, that is a great movie.
It is a great movie.
I think what happened was two things. One was, as I said, in the 1890s, he said he could send 400,000 volts along a wire and light up Chicago from Niagara Falls. It sounded ridiculous. It happened to be true. But the other thing I think that really eventually did him in was when he was in Colorado Springs, he received pulse frequencies on his equipment. It sounded something like this: beep, beep, beep. And he thought that they were messages from Mars. And there was a lot of belief in those days that as we were coming upon the new age, the new age of technology, the 20th century, that we were going to catch up to the Martians that were about 1 million years ahead of us in evolution.
Oh, excuse me. I'm sorry. That was this is something I'm not aware of. That was a commonly held thought back then?
Yes. H.G. Wells wrote War of the Worlds. Percival Lowell, who was the brother of the president of Harvard University, has a huge telescope, which is in Flagstaff, Arizona. It's still one of the largest telescopes in the world. And Lowell would photograph what he called the canals of Mars. And the idea was that the Martians had irrigated the entire planet. There were a number of astronomers. Camille Flammarion was a very famous French astronomer who believed in the canals of Mars. So there are many people. Even Elihu Thompson thought that the canals of Mars were real. So many people thought that. And I said, H.G. Wells. So there was a lot of people that believed in this whole thing. And Tesla said, I've received pulse frequencies from outer space. I think maybe they're from the Martians. And so had he succeeded in Wardenclyffe, I think this would have all, gone by the wayside. But because he didn't succeed in Wardenclyffe, and because he talked about far-out ideas, he ended up in the fringes. And in fact, the book of patents that I told you that I got that from a UFO group in the 1970s. His name was kept alive in the UFO circles And so he became part of the occult, part of the hidden.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. That's basically how I became familiar with him. Now, part of that is due to the fact that he had the ability to actually envision his creations in his mind in complete detail. Now, this is, correct me if I'm wrong, reassemble them and test them before actually making them materially. Is that along the lines of part of what, is that a truth?
Yeah, there's an interesting story about this. Tesla was friends with a Pulitzer Prize-winning newspaper writer. His name is John O'Neill. And O'Neill knew Tesla for 40 years, and he wrote the first major biography of Tesla called Prodigal Genius. It's a great book. And after I read that book, I had many questions. So I wrote my book, Wizard, to try and answer the questions that are left by the O'Neill book. But O'Neill talks about Tesla's powers of vision, and Tesla talks about it in his own autobiography. He had extreme powers of eidetic imagery. He had the ability to memorize entire plays. He knew all of Shakespeare by heart. He knew Faust by heart. He knew maybe the whole Bible by heart. Maybe not the whole thing, but I think he could know the entire Bible. He had a photographic memory. So he really did build a lot of this equipment in his mind. Now, what happened, all of his papers were eventually sent to Serbia, and they discovered all these mathematical notes that he took in Colorado Springs, all high-level mathematics and equations and this and that. And one of the head of the Tesla Museum, Dr. Marincin, says, let's publish this. And the rest of the Serbian community said no, because it'll destroy the belief that he has these great mystical powers. And Marincin said, no, I mean, we know he had those great powers, but he also worked this stuff out on paper. Let's publish it. So he had to fight against that, and he eventually published the Colorado Spring Notes. So both are true. He had tremendous powers of imagery, but he had taken courses in higher mathematics. This isn't all stuff that he just worked out in his head. He had all the math behind it. And I've worked with electrical engineers who have duplicated all of his stuff. And it's all right. Everything that he says works out. The calculations are all correct. It's the basis of textbooks in alternating current, for instance, are all based on Tesla's original writings, which are all strict mathematical equations.
Okay, so he did have, you're saying, some ability. He definitely had a great ability, because I think the metaphysical community and the ufology community basically sort of glom onto him because of that ability that he had to have these visions of these inventions and these creations as if they maybe came from another source. I also heard that he did have a bit of a relationship with spirituality and with Buddhism or with the Vedas as well. Yes.
There's other aspects to this. His discovery of how to harness alternating current came in a vision. He had been very ill, and when you read his autobiography, it's very clear. He had an opening up of the third eye. He definitely did. His crown chakra opened up, and at that moment, he had this vision as to how to harness alternating current. So he writes about that in detail. He also writes about out-of-body experiences that he's had. And he was friends with Vivekananda, who was a guru in the 1890s, who had been at the Chicago World's Fair. And they discuss the Akashic Records. They discuss metaphysics. He was very interested in all those areas. But he's also skeptical. He was skeptical about telepathy. So he's a complicated contradiction. So in certain ways, he's very metaphysical. In other ways, he kind of, makes you, how can you not believe in telepathy?
Right, yeah.
He's like a wireless. So he drives a little nuts sometimes.
Yeah, most definitely. He definitely was a complicated man, and as you're doing a wonderful job of introducing myself and the listeners to who he was. Now, there was also, though, in 1898, a fire in his laboratory that I understand it cost him over $1 million in damage. Did anybody ever say, ooh, maybe Edison started that fire, or maybe it was like somebody who was working against him? Is any of that out there, or is it just on the record, it's just a fire?
there was speculation. I did a lot of research about it, the fire. There was a company that had clean clothes, and they had a lot of sparking equipment that used a lot of heat. It was right below his lab. It was he's on a floor above this cleaning place, and I can't be 100% sure, but I'm 99% sure that it was an honest fire, that it was not set by Edison or anybody like that.
Okay, so it's just...
I understand why someone would think that it would be.
Yeah, I the first thing is that when I read it, I was like, okay, the enemies are coming after him, so to speak. But obviously, that's just, maybe my conspiracy way of thinking. And it was
one of the interesting things about it is that he doesn't have a lab now, and he goes to Edison, and Edison provides him with a lab.
Okay.
Edison came to his aid a couple of times, and and they have an interesting friendship. I grew up in the old days. My heroes were Willie Mays and Mickey Mantle, and to me, Edison and Tesla, like the Willie Mays and Mickey Mantle of today, that day. And
so they weren't sworn enemies then per se. I mean, there seems to be this indication from some of the things that I read that they were arch enemies, and that was it, arch enemies, but they were not. You're saying?
No, there were times when Edison wrote Tesla and commiserated with him. They went fishing together, and Edison provided a lab for Tesla when he needed one on 2 occasions. So I think there was like a love-hate thing. I think there was some jealousy between the two. Like rivalries, you have Brett Favre and Tom Brady. There are these rivalries which exist, and you're kind of jealous of them, but you also respect each other. I think there was some of that.
Okay, well, that kind of clears things up a little bit in terms of it just being a situation where Tesla was absolutely an enemy of Edison. Now, what happened with Marconi? Now, I understand that eventually Tesla became credited with the invention of the radio.
What happened was Tesla really disliked Marconi, and the reason was he offered him his equipment, and Marconi said he didn't need it, and then he pirated it. And so he really disliked Marconi. And then when Marconi got the Nobel Prize for Tesla's invention, Tesla totally freaked out. So he really disliked Marconi, and Edison never got a Nobel Prize. And there's a quote in the New York Times where Tesla says, they ask, do you think Edison should get a Nobel Prize? And Tesla says, oh, yeah, he deserves a half a dozen Nobel Prizes. What he's doing is he's putting down the Nobel Prize Committee. He's saying, it's a backwards insult to the Nobel Prize. Oh, yeah, Edison deserves a half a dozen of them. They're so easy to get,
But now, is it true that eventually he did gain credit for the radio instead of Marconi?
Yes. What I discovered, in 1915, Franklin Roosevelt was Assistant Secretary of the Navy, and Marconi had sued the Navy for using his system in their wireless communications for the Navy. And what Franklin Roosevelt discovered was that Tesla's work predated Marconi. So in the legal suit against Marconi during World War I, they used Tesla's patents to dispute Marconi. And that laid the basis 15 years later, in the early 1940s, for the Supreme Court to overturn Marconi as the inventor in favor of Tesla. So Tesla really is the primary inventor of the radio ahead of Marconi. And the Supreme Court of the United States backs that up.
Wow, that's a nice little piece of information. I don't think that's really made it into many history books, though.
No, it hasn't. The whole Franklin Roosevelt connection is not there. I have the actual letter, a copy of the letter, where Franklin Roosevelt, signed by Franklin Roosevelt, where he says we must use the Tesla patents to battle against Marconi.
Fantastic. Well, maybe Tesla will gradually, as time goes on, get a little bit more of his due, due to your research and also due to people becoming more aware of who he was and the different technologies that are out there today.
Yeah, you bring up a point that is kind of funny for me. I have a friend, his name is Dr. Voyevich. He's the head of the Tesla Memorial Society in New York. And he calls me up. It was in the year 2000. Life magazine had listed 100 most important people of the last 1,000 years. And Marconi was like number 27 or something, and Tesla was number 56. And he was all up in arms. He said, I'm so angry, Marconi's ahead of Tesla. I said, you should be happy that Tesla's on the list.
Yeah.
So he's on the list, of one of the 100 most important people of the last 1,000 years. I think that's a tremendous achievement to be on that list.
Okay, well that's good, and I guess it certainly is. I mean, the 100 most important people of the last 1,000 years. Wow, I wonder where can that list be found? I'd like to take a look at that list myself. I'm kind of curious.
I'm sure if you just put Life Magazine, you Google Life Magazine, 100 most people of the last 1,000 years, the number one person was the guy who invented movable type.
Oh, really? Gutenberg?
Yeah, which is a very interesting choice. And I think that if you compare Gutenberg's invention to the Internet today, I mean, it was so transformative. I mean, of all the people that they could have chosen, that's how, when books could be produced so cheaply, I think we're at that dawning age again. But I'm sure if you Googled that, you'd come up with a list.
Okay, yeah, I'm going to do that. And we're going to start taking some questions here in a minute as well. And then I want to talk a little bit about how Tesla ended up pretty much leaving this planet in obscurity, dying in obscurity, because his name sort of just fell out of the common knowledge and things like that. And he also had this reputation for feeding the pigeons and things like that. So we can talk a little bit more about that. But I have a gentleman on the line, I believe it's Chris, and let's see if he has a question here that he'd like to ask. Hello, Chris.
Yes. My question is for Mark Seifer.
Sure.
Mark, you know why Tesla died in obscurity. You know why he didn't receive his Nobel. It's because he made earthquakes. Earthquake number 333 on September 3 at 3:03 p.m. epicenter time in 1899 in Alaska. It lasted 27 days, and he did it from the Nob Hill apparatus. You admitted it to me on the phone. You said, and I quote, "It is a weapon. Who the heck told you? Why are you running around telling everybody? Do you want another Haiti?" Did you or did you not say that?
Mark, are you there?
Yeah, this is a nut who's been bothering me for a number of years.
No, did you or did you not say that?
I wish you'd just turn this guy off,
Well,
you wish you could, but it's truth. I want truth. Tesla made earthquakes. You know it's true, Mark. Admit the truth.
Well, I mean, let me just say, Chris, really quickly here, even if Tesla did make earthquakes, I mean, that's just part of what his invention
It's a top
nature
secret
was.
scalar weapon that my grandfather told me on his deathbed. My grandfather had top secret security clearance at Los Alamos National Laboratories. He told me as he died. Okay, he wasn't lying. Mark has avoided me, and Mark admitted it to me on the phone. I want to know the truth, Mark. Did you or did you not say that to me on the phone?
Well, look, Chris, you know what? Let's take this.
No, I want to know. I want an answer. I want an answer. Yes or no. Did you or did you not say it is a weapon? Who the hell told you? Why are you running around telling everybody? Do you want another Haiti?
Okay, so Chris, let me do this. All right, we're going to take that answer off the air now. Okay?
No, I don't want the answer off the air. I want the answer on the air.
Well, I will give you the answer. I'll get
Mark knows the answer. That's why he's not saying it. This is about truth. This is Blog Talk Radio, baby. It's the truth. Tesla made earthquake number 333 on September 3 at 3:03 p.m. epicenter time in 1899 in Alaska. And you know what? That's why he died in room 3327, because it commenced at 3:03 and 27 seconds. It was a second divisible by 3 times 3, in a minute divisible by 3, in an hour divisible by 3, on a day divisible by 3, in a month divisible by 3 times 3, in a year divisible by 3 times 3, and it was earthquake Milnshine 333 for Christ's sake, and it lasted 3 times 3 times 3 days. Read Tesla's quotes. All repeated actions had to be divisible by 3. If they weren't, I felt impelled to do them again, even if it took hours.
Okay, Chris.
Listen. No, I want to hear his answer. Did he or did he not tell me that?
What I need for you to do right now, though, is just to calm down a little bit, because this is
you know what? I want the truth.
Okay.
I read his book. I bought his book twice. I want the truth. Did you or did you not say that?
The truth is that you keep cursing online.
And I didn't curse.
Using
I said
foul
the word
language.
hell, and you said it first.
You don't use the F word too, my friend.
I didn't use the F
and
word.
And you keep cursing, and you're nuts.
Did
so
I
I'm
use
not
the F word?
You. That's the end of it.
No, what's the answer?
Okay, so Chris,
you know I'm not lying, man. You know I'm not lying, Mark. Tell the truth. Tell the truth.
Excuse me 1 second here.
Tell the truth.
Chris.
Tell the truth.
Chris, if you don't allow me to speak, I'm just going to disconnect your microphone.
Well, no, he's not answering the question because he doesn't want to lie.
It doesn't really matter. The question.
Yes, it does. It's a very important question. Tell the truth.
We can deal with the question in
yes or no. It's a yes or no answer. Tell the truth, Mark.
All right, Chris, let me ask you a question really quickly.
Yeah.
What difference does the answer make to you?
It makes a lot of difference. It's a very important answer. I want to know. He knows what's up. He's the Tesla foremost expert in the world. You know, he's a handwriting expert. You know, he's done the work. He knows the truth. Okay, it's being held because, you know, I'm telling you, it could have been free energy 100 years ago. Pierpont didn't tell you to sell you copper, and Mark knows it. And he says it's a weapon, but you know what? They've had 111 years to have a. You know, this is ridiculous. I want to know my answer. I want it answered now.
Okay, so listen, I want to thank you, man, for calling in and posing such a question. We're going to talk about it a little bit. You can stay listening if you like, okay?
No, I want my answer. Mark, what's up?
Hello, Mark. Are you still there?
I can't take this guy, you know. I mean,
well, you know, he's just a little hyper.
He's been bugging me for years. He's been bugging me for years. He's been bugging me online.
I'm sure he means well, but I mean the problem.
No, I don't think he does mean well. I really don't. I mean, he's cursing online against me. I mean, I don't know why I should have to deal with a person like that.
Well, let's talk a little bit about the earthquake thing, though, because I did read online that well, first of all, the thing that he's talking about, the 3x3x3, I also read that was a quote to Tesla that it doesn't work out divisible by 3, he does it again. Is that true?
I mentioned, you know, particle beam weapons. I mentioned the earthquakes in the book. I mean, it's all in there. But you know, what Tesla had was an oscillator. And he put it on a major beam downstairs in his laboratory, and he set this main beam in resonance. And once you did that, other beams that were in resonance with that main beam would go into resonance, and you could create an earthquake. So he certainly did create an earthquake, and he certainly dealt with numbers like this. As I mentioned, you know, he worked on his calculations.
Well, you know, I mean, for me, myself, as just another human being, you know, we already know that, you know, the man was a genius, and whether or not he was able to, he certainly was responsible for technologies that have led to weaponry today. I think that's probably true. I mean, when you have that kind of knowledge, technologically speaking, it can go one way or it can go the other. And whether or not, I think mostly from what I'm getting from your research into Tesla, he seemed more concerned on many levels about how his technology was going to be used. And from some of the things that I've read, he often held back on information so that the technology wasn't used or wasn't misused. So I could have conceived that it was totally possible. For instance, this legend that there was a building being constructed in Manhattan, and he went down to the building, and I guess this device that you're talking about, which could easily fit in his pocket, now maybe this is just legend, he was able to start literally shaking the building until the guys that were on it became pretty concerned and came down and called the cops. Now, that's what I read. True?
Yeah, well, he actually did do that. I mean, I'm sure he did that because the technology is very simple. There are, you know, marching when troops march across a bridge, they break their marching rank because they could set the bridge in resonance and collapse the bridge. So they're not supposed to march, you know, in lockstep when they go across a bridge. It's that principle. You know, Joshua, you know, in the Bible, using the horn to take down a building. That's the principle that he was using. He also wrote about splitting the earth in two by using the same principle. The thing with the particle beam weapons is this is Star Wars, and this is, you know, basically the world that we're in right now. I mean, I'm frankly sorry that we invented the atom bomb. We're stuck with this thing. So you've got these great weapons, and so one of the reasons we never went to war with Russia is because we would both lose, you know. And so Tesla was dealing with what became Star Wars technology, shooting down planes coming in, but you know, all that's in the book. And so he's hoping that if everybody had a tremendous defensive system, we would have world peace. But it's the same, you know. Did you ever see Dr. Strangelove?
I didn't. Maybe bits and pieces of it. I never actually watched the whole thing.
Well, the idea of it, it's what's called MAD, mutual assured destruction. You know, that we're in this mad world, and you know, that's what. So Tesla was definitely dealing with these kinds of issues, but he was he was an idealist. He was hoping that if everybody had excellent defensive weaponry, then war would become obsolete. But ultimately, you're dealing with people. You're dealing with personalities, and so that's the problem.
Well, this is true. You're also dealing with people that want to play with unlimited power. Let's talk about Tesla and Einstein for a minute. Now, what were Tesla's feelings about Einstein's theory of relativity?
He really completely disagreed with his theory of relativity. It took me many years to figure out what he was saying. What Tesla was saying was that what we call gravity, what he said was that the sun was absorbing more energy than it was radiating. And, you know, when I first read that, I said, that's crazy. I mean, the sun's so hot. How could it be absorbing more energy than it's radiating? But the more I thought about it, the more sense it began to make to me, and I began to realize that this was Tesla's secret theory on gravity. And so where Tesla disagreed with Einstein, Einstein was saying that space curved around stars. So Tesla saying, how could nothing be curved? And what Einstein was measuring, if you look at starlight as it passes, let's say, the sun, it'll bend towards the sun. So why is it bending towards the sun? Einstein was saying it's bending towards the sun because the space was curved, and Tesla saying it's bending towards the sun because it's being sucked in by the energy of the sun. So they're looking at it in two different ways. So Tesla totally disagreed with Einstein's theory of relativity, and I write about it in another book. It's called Transcending the Speed of Light. I go into great detail explaining what Tesla's theory is, and it's actually a very interesting and simple theory.
Well, while we have a few minutes here, why don't you run down a couple of those books and where people can find them, and also your website as well.
My website is my name, markseifer.com, MarkSeifer.com. Then Wizard, is the Tesla biography, and the other book that I wrote on this topic is called Transcending the Speed of Light. And it's really, it's so elegant. The theory is so elegant and simple. I'd like to simply explain it to you. What is gravity? What Tesla is saying is that mass is absorbing energy all of the time. So when you jump up and you land back on the Earth, what is, they're saying it's gravity. What it really is, according to Tesla's theory, is that the Earth requires a tremendous amount of energy from ether that it's absorbing. So when you jump up, the reason you fall back to the Earth is you get in the way of this influx. Mm-hmm. So it's a very different way of looking at the structure of the universe. And one of the things I found was that electrons actually spin at 1.37 times the speed of light. They're spinning faster than the speed of light. They violate relativity. And Einstein was aware of this. Dirac was aware of this. Everyone was aware of this in the 1920s. And they didn't know what to do with it because it violated relativity. So what Dirac did was he said, let's not call it 1.37 times the speed of light. Let's call it the square root of -1. He made up it's called an imaginary number. So if you call electron spin the square root of -1, which is the letter I as an italic I, you can now combine relativity with quantum mechanics, and Dirac got a Nobel Prize for this. And so what happened was the tachyonic realm, the realm faster than the speed of light, disappeared, just like Tesla's name disappeared. This whole idea that elementary particles spin faster than the speed of light disappeared. So Tesla was talking about ether theory. He was talking about what now is zero-point energy and also the tachyonic realm, and a whole different view of what he thought gravity was. And so his view was very different from Einstein's. And so, ironically, Tesla disputes Einstein's theories, but when Tesla turned 75, Einstein writes him a letter, a handwritten letter, which congratulates Tesla on his 75th birthday and for his theories in alternating current. So there is a letter between the two, but it's a one-way letter. It's a letter from Einstein to Tesla.
Interesting. Now, let's talk about HAARP technology for a minute and its relationship to some of Tesla's discoveries. Would we even have the HAARP technology today if it were not for what Tesla has discovered?
No, I don't think we would. I mean, all of our wireless, studies are based on Tesla's technology. There's a lot of hidden stuff in his technology, and this theory on gravity, which I talked about, I found in one obscure paper where it was unpublished. That was his. So there's a ton of stuff, that we don't know about his work. But HAARP is, very interesting. The whole idea of also having some type of a global navigation system, of a radar, a global radar system, is what some of this is based on. So, no, I don't think we would have all that. And a lot of these scientists know about Tesla's work as well. I mean, he's very well known in the inner circles.
Well, I would suspect so. Actually, we have another question, another person here online, and Jim from Wilmington. Hello, Jim.
Hello. I just want to ask Dr. C for one question. If Tesla had been allowed and got all his funding, and there was no obstacles put by anybody, how does he think the world would be different now?
The way I think the world would be different, as I mentioned, I really think that we would have had a global wireless system of radio and wireless telephone at the turn of the century. I think for sure that would have happened. In other words, a mass communication system would have happened at a much more rapid rate. And as I mentioned, a lot of the things that we've seen, like the collapse of East Germany so rapidly, and the falling of the wall, and the unification of the world that we're seeing now would have happened at a much more rapid rate. So it's hard to really, see for sure. But I just feel that the world wars would have been fought differently if we had more mass communication. And I think people would have gotten along better, and terrible things couldn't be hidden so well. So many people, they didn't, as I mentioned, during World War II, they didn't know about the death camps, about Hitler's death camps. If they had known, they would have bombed, the ovens and all of that stuff. So if we had a mass communication system, some little guy with a cell phone sitting in a death camp could punch out, say, "Hey, death camp, hit this place,"
Right.
But in 1940s, we were still at a very primitive realm because we were 20-something years, later. Mass communication was starting 20 years later than it should have started. And things happen on a scale that that's logarithmic. So everything would happen much more rapidly as opposed to a linear evolution.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Jim.
Goodbye.
Bye. So, Mark, now this genius who was the toast of society, this inventor, and who hobnobbed with, the cream of New York society and was known around the world, died virtually penniless, in debt, in the New Yorker hotel on the 33rd floor, as this other gentleman so kindly pointed out. How did he get there?
Well, partly it was the Depression, but he really wasn't penniless. But he what happened was Hugo Gernsback, who started all the sci-fi magazines, went to the Westinghouse Company and basically shamed them into having them cover Tesla's rent. Tesla had a habit of not paying his rent, and I think he kind of took it out on the hotels. He felt like the world owed him something, I guess. And so Westinghouse started to pay his rent. So his rent was being taken care of at the Hotel New Yorker, but certainly he was no longer, the multi-millionaire. He never really was a millionaire, but he lived like a millionaire at a much earlier time.
Right. Well, I mean, I would personally myself, if I was responsible for alternating current, and every time I switched the bathroom light on, I had to thank myself, I wouldn't even want to pay rent, So that's just me. So, I can see why he would be a little peeved about that. But he was still died in virtual obscurity, though.
That's for sure. But he was working on, as I mentioned, the particle beam weapon, and he was negotiating with the Soviets at that time, also the Brits. These were our allies during World War II, and, of course, the United States.
So he was still working? He was still working up until, what are you saying, a few months before he died or a few years before he died?
I would say up into his early 80s. When you look at pictures of him, when he was 86, he was really wasted. He was very, very thin. But all the way up through about 1940 or 41, he was still working on the particle beam weapon. And he was getting monies from these countries. So he had sources of revenues. But he certainly was totally obscure. His nephew, who now runs the Tesla Society in New Jersey, Bill Turbo, he knew him when he was a young boy, and he was just known as his crazy old uncle. He didn't really truly appreciate who he was until he was much older. So Tesla definitely disappeared from the history books. I think the McCarthy period of the 1950s played a role. I also think the fact that Marconi, gets all the limelight, played a big role, and Edison, and it's a simplification of history. I did, in my doctoral dissertation, I did a study of all the books that leave Tesla's name out on the history of invention. And I found many, many books, they don't even mention it. So certainly, you're right. He definitely was very died in obscurity. But he was, every year on his birthday, he would give a press conference, and they certainly covered it. You can just look in the New York Times, and you'll see in the 1930s, year after year, there's an article about Tesla. So he was in there, but it was in the third. It was in some of the back pages. It wasn't a front page.
Okay. Now, what can you tell us about his habit of feeding the pigeons? Being a typical New Yorker, back in the day, the 1940, early 1943 or something, I'd walk by the New York Hotel. I'd see some tall, skinny guy, older gentleman, with a bunch of pigeons around him, I assume, and that would have been Tesla.
Yeah, that's for sure. I think, I discuss his vicarious love affair that he had with Katherine Johnson. He was also very good friends with Marguerite Merrington. He loved women, but he was a celibate. He really had devoted his life to science. He grew up on a farm, and I think he really enjoyed the physical comfort from the pigeons. And he tells John O'Neill that he fell in love with one of the pigeons. I know it sounds ridiculous, but I know if you know animals, I have like a theory about dogs. I think some dogs are just, stupid dogs, and other dogs are secretly human. And we all know those dogs that are secretly human.
Sure.
They're your equals. You just talk to them. They're just another regular guy that you know. And I think he had some of the pigeons, and one in particular, he had that level of communication with. They were on an equal level. And so he definitely really cared for the pigeons. He kept them in his apartment in the Hotel New Yorker.
Oh, he did?
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
And he would go out to the park, and he would feed them. And I think he gained comfort from being there because it brought back his childhood, and because it was the need for social warmth, and that he had denied himself. So I think, you could go to town on a Freudian level with it, but I think on a simple level, he just enjoyed that world of pigeons. I mean, if you go to St. Mark's Square in Venice, you see all the people feeding the pigeons. I mean, it's common in a lot of countries.
Well, of course it is. I mean, it's common here in New York too. Although I don't necessarily know anyone who would. And now that you mention it, I do remember reading that ways back, as a matter of fact, that he had claimed to have fallen in love with one of the pigeons. I believe was the reincarnation of somebody that he had a crush on or been in love with, or something to the sort. So he definitely was his own character, for lack of a better word.
I've spent a little bit of time looking at pigeons to try and figure out what he saw in them. And if you really sit down and look at them, they have these incredible iridescent colors. I mean, and there's a whole world. I mean, it's it's like watching a nature show. I mean, you have to look at it from that point of view because it's easy to make fun of. It's I think it makes more sense to look at the depth of it and see it from that angle.
Well, I mean, for me, I'm not going to argue necessarily with somebody. If somebody is able to visualize a machine and create it in their mind and disassemble it, or who has their crown chakras open to a certain degree, obviously they have extrasensory perceptions, and those perceptions may not make them appear to be normal as most people, because they have already had access to other dimensions. So they're going to act a little bit off the wall. So I'm not. For me, myself personally, I find this fascinating about him, and it tells me more about him. But I don't find it anything terribly odd.
No, and also, what about the use of the pigeons for messaging, for sending messages?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, they have amazing ability to come home from hundreds of miles. So there's that other level to it. I think these pigeons are reading the electromagnetic rays of the Earth, and they might be reading the stars. I mean, it's a big question as to how the homing pigeons, get back. So there's so many levels to this thing.
Yes, there are many levels to it. Now, Tesla had a belief that eventually women would become the dominant force of the future, that humanity would be run by queen bees, parentheses. Elaborate a little bit on that if you are familiar with that.
What he felt was that women had been put down for so many generations that they would, in a sense, overcompensate and try to get back all that they lost through the generations. And I think, in a way, we can see this happening. I mean, we see, the rise of Hillary Clinton and, of course, the rise of Sarah Palin, two women in both the parties that have, gained great prominence. But also, now there are women governors, there are women senators, and there is a theory, too, that women, by nature, because they're females, are going to be less bellicose. They'll be less argumentative in that regard, and that if women really had a greater say in the world, we would be less likely to have wars. So I think he was looking at it from an evolutionary standpoint, and it turns out he's actually right. I mean, we've seen the rise of women since the 1920s, and they got the right to vote, all the way to a lady running for president and coming within a hair's breadth of becoming president.
I think it also shows that even though he was definitely devoted to his work, it wasn't as if he was totally oblivious to the opposite sex and what their effect upon society was. So he definitely seems to have given it some thought, even to have gotten this far with it, in terms of the nature of women, in terms of their sensitivity, of maybe their ability to be, like I said, less bellicose, to be more reasonable. So that also shows a certain side of him as well, a more human side, I think.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, and this is what Katherine Johnson kept trying to get from him. I mean, she's definitely in love with him. She's in love with her husband, but she's got this love of this incredible, famous inventor. And you hit the nail on the head. It's this humanness. He needs the human factor because he could just devote all of his life to science. And so the Johnsons become his surrogate family. They have 2 children, and he spends all Christmases and Thanksgivings there. He goes traveling, out on the island to the Hamptons with them. And And the letters between Catherine and Tesla, they read like love letters, and clearly there was a very, very deep relationship there. And those people who know the Tesla story, Catherine is such an interesting lady. She's the wife of the editor of Century Magazine. She's good friends with Rudyard Kipling and Mark Twain and John Muir, the Muir Woods, Teddy Roosevelt, and all these kinds of people. And she's ahead of her time because she's thwarted, because she's a female who wants to advance, but she can't because she's a girl. And you see this aspect to her. So she wants Tesla back in her orb, and she feeds him. She demands that he come because she's spending too much time in bed. You must come now. We must see you. And there is a very human side. A troubleshooter in Paris.
Now, let me just quickly, before you go any further, you said he became interested in electricity. What kind of experiments were being done with electricity at that time that he would have become more fascinated with it? Where was electricity at that point?
Well, I've been to his place in Smiljan, and it's against a long plain. It's a hill against a long plain. You can see the mountains, the Dinaric Alps in the distance, maybe 20, 30 miles away. So he had to have seen unbelievable lightning storms. Because he could see easily 20 miles from his house, and he also discussed static electricity that came off his cat, and his cat would be electrified like in the winter. You'd see a corona of light around the cat sometimes. Sparks would fly. But in those days, they had what was known as direct current, and that's what Edison was using. And direct current, electricity by its nature alternates, which means that it changes its direction of flow at many times a second. So if you think of a stream going downhill, you would harness a stream with a water wheel. But can you imagine if the stream was going downhill and then going uphill and then going downhill and then going uphill and trying to put a water wheel on that?
Right.
No one knew how to do that. And so what they did was they got rid of the uphill stream, and they just dealt with the downhill stream, and that's what direct current was, but it was very inefficient. So you could only send electricity about a mile in those days, and only for lighting houses. You couldn't run a refrigerator, you couldn't run a vacuum cleaner. I first became familiar with Tesla in 1976. I was working on an article on a guru by the name of Lapsang Lampa.
Yes.
And he had written a number of books, and I was. It turns out that he's British, and he's got the spirit of a Tibetan, flowing through him. So I was writing an article for a magazine, a national magazine, and I'd gone down to New York to do some research, and there was a book on Rampa, and it was on other avatars, these enlightened beings who come to the earth. Jesus was mentioned, and then there was this guy Tesla, and it said Tesla invented all these things. You listed all of them in the preamble: fluorescent lights, wireless communication, remote control, electrical power system, and his name was Tesla, and I had never heard of him. And my father was an electrical engineer. He fixed TVs in the early 1950s. I used to go out with my dad. I had a crystal radio set, which was a wireless radio set, and so I knew a bit about electricity. And I said, if this guy really lived and he invented all these things as much as Edison, I would know who he was. So since I was in the New York Public Library, I started to research him, and I found there were articles with his name on it from 1915, 1918. And I said, wow, this guy's real. He's actually real. So I then got a book of his patents. And once I saw it, it's like a 500-page book. It's got articles and patents that he's written. And I dug into the patents, and I said, my gosh, he really has patents on all these things. I'm going to find out if it's really him or Marconi who invented the radio, if it's really him or Edison is responsibility. What Tesla is able to explain to J.P. Morgan at the turn of the century, this is 1901, that he can create an unlimited number of wireless telephone stations. And this is way before we had wireless telephone, but he had already had the patent on how to do it. Now every single person on the planet practically has their own cell phone, and it's all based on Tesla's patents. Also, they are outlawing incandescent lamps. The Edison lamps are being outlawed, and Tesla's the inventor of fluorescent lighting. He has also patents on hydroelectric power system that we have. And he's also got a patent on what became the Osprey helicopter. It's a $40 million plane that takes off like a helicopter and then flies like a regular plane. It's a tilt rotor. The propeller tilts forward. You mentioned the word genius, and Tesla really is a genius. I mean, I think the word is way overused, but he is an inventor in many different realms. He didn't just stay in one. Most great people stay in one field, and that's what they're good at. He was in a number of different fields, and he excelled in all of those, and he's behind a lot of he lays the foundation for things, for so many technologies.
Let's go back a little bit and talk about when Tesla first came over here, where he was born, and his arrival into the United States. What can you tell us about that?
Well, Tesla was born in 1856 in Smiljan. If you've ever been to Rome, about 150 miles across the Adriatic is where Smiljan is. It would take, 8 or 9 or 10 hours to drive it, but you can get there by plane in a very rapid fashion. It's near, maybe it's about an hour south of Zagreb in Croatia. And so he was born in Croatia, but he was a Serb. There were two main groups in that area of the world. There were the Croats and the Serbs. They're the exact same people biologically, but one are Roman Catholics and the other are Greek Orthodox.
Okay.
And they don't like each other, unfortunately. So Tesla grew up in a hostile environment. What's good about it is that he's a sign of unity for those two countries that still actually fighting against each other. Even today, they don't like each other. But they can both claim Tesla because he was born in one country and he was the religion of another. So his father was a priest because the Greek Orthodox priests could get married. And his father wanted him to either join the priesthood or maybe go into the military. And eventually he ended up, studying electricity. And he said, I want to devote my life to electricity. And he went to college in Austria and then in Prague, at the University of Prague. And he was an A-plus student, but he never really graduated college. But he took, advanced geometry and physics and calculus and all these great courses. But he didn't need a 4-year degree in those days. This was about 1875. And he went out on his own, and he started to work eventually for Tom Edison in Paris. And he was responsible for our electrical power system, that kind of thing. And he became the subject of my doctoral dissertation, and that was really how I got interested in Tesla.
So you actually got interested in Tesla from Rampa's writings? You said Rampa actually mentioned him? Is that what you said?
No, it was in a book about avatars.
I see.
Enlightened beings. And it listed a bunch of them. One was Rampa, and I was reading the book because I was writing an article on him, and another was this guy Tesla.
Now, you said you picked up the book of patents. What are some of those patents that you read about?
Well, Tesla really is the primary inventor behind the radio. And, I set out, in a sense, to disprove it because I didn't believe that one guy could be behind all of these things. He's got patents on the radio. He's got patents on wireless. He has patents on what's called the Tesla coil. He has a patent on an oscillator which produces a complex frequency, a continuous wave frequency. When Marconi was transmitting across the Atlantic, he was using Morse code, dot, 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 dash, dash, dash. And you can't transmit voice or pictures or sound through a dot, dot, dot kind of a Morse code kind of a system. We use continuous wave frequencies, and those are Tesla frequencies, so that it's an oscillator that he produced. So when you go back to the history of television, you'll find that the first TV images, which were produced around 1905, were using Tesla oscillators and Tesla currents. So there are patents on that. There's a patent on cell phone technology.